everyone and welcome. My name is Gretchen and this is Carrie, and we work at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, and today we are in our Revolution War era farm, and we're going to be talking a little bit about a topic that comes up quite often: hygiene in the 18th century. So come on, let's get started. So hello, Carrie and I are going to be talking about hygiene in the 18th century. And so I think Carrie will agree that a question that comes up quite often when people come out to visit us, or not even a question so much, sometimes it'll just be a statement. They will say things like, people back then never took baths, people back then never bathed. But I think a better question might be, did people in the 18th century want to keep clean? And the answer to that is yes. You might not totally submerge yourself in a bath and still want to be clean, still remain clean by washing yourself every day. And so washing your face, washing your hands is something that was very important to them in the 18th century. The outward appearance would be very clean. So you might have a water basin and a water pitcher that you're filling up every morning and using a towel or a rag to wash your face and wash your hands. You might do that in the evening before you go to bed, and you might do that again in the morning.
I think it's interesting that you see a lot of references specifically for soaps for the hands or for the feet. You also see specific references to things like shampoo at the time, and they are for the most part full of ingredients that everybody would have, whether it be lye and ash for your soap, to things like rose water, which you could probably make on your own farm, or you're seeing things like eggs and rum being combined for use on caring for the hair. Even though you don't see a lot of references on for the body specifically, soaps for the body, you are still seeing things other than just for cleaning the home.
Right. And there's not a lot of references to actually bathing in the 18th century, because I think it's one of those things that we do every day. Like if you brush your teeth, you're not going to write that in your diary every day. But the references we do have come from people like Thomas Jefferson, who liked to soak his feet in a cold bath of water on occasion. And you see references to William Byrd II, who said he liked to take a swim in the James River almost daily, no matter the time of year. They even talk about Lord Dunmore, who was the last royal governor of Virginia, would sit out in his bathhouse and have servants pour cold water on him because he found the Virginia summers to be a little bit too much. But every one of these instances, there's two things to consider. One, all of those men are free and wealthy, and therefore they might have more opportunity to wash themselves and have servants assist in that. And the other thing to consider is they don't ever really mention doing any of these things to get clean. They talk about it being invigorating or keeping the doctor away or staying cool. So sometimes when we think about getting clean, we associate that always with bathing, and you might be doing it for recreation depending on who you are, which brings up another good point. Everybody in Tidewater, Virginia, 18th century is not wealthy and would not always have servants. So you might be talking about a very large portion of the population, like enslaved people or impoverished people, or even the middling sort, who might not always have time for these things.
Yeah, that's a good point, that if you are the one that is tasked with collecting water, whether it be from a well out in town or from a well on your farm or from a river, you may not have time to bathe yourself. It may be a very quick, maybe splash some water on your face and you're good to go for the day. Because if you are already getting up with the sun or before the sun, you have so much work to do. You may not want to get up earlier to get extra water for yourself.
Right. Yeah. So to Carrie's point, sometimes we reference the enslaved people that lived on a farm owned by a man named Edward Moss, And Edward Moss owned 6 people, or at least at the time of his death, he owned 6 people, and 3 were adults and 3 were children. And so I oftentimes wonder, even though there's a good chance that many of them were field hands and not so much domestic servants, were they the ones in charge of getting water for the Moss family in the morning? And so, like Carrie said, you're already having to get up with the sun. Are you going to go and haul in the water from the well for your own family first and then go and do it for the free family or for the enslaver? And I think that might determine how often you're doing it. And also just environment. If you look at how poor whites and enslaved people are living, for the most part, they're living in very small cabins with dirt floors, and they are piled on top of each other in a lot of cases. And so it doesn't make for great conditions for keeping clean in the first place. A lot of times we talk about how they might not be thinking their bodies are dirty so much as the clothes, which is easy if you are gentry class, or even if you're middling, you might have a clean shirt to put on every day. But if you're enslaved or if you're impoverished, do you have that second set of clothes? So yes, the clothes are dirty and not you, but if you never change your clothes, or if you do it very infrequently, you would still be considered, dirty.
There's a quote from John Wesley that most people are familiar with, the cleanliness is next to godliness. And to that point, that actually didn't refer to being clean of body, but rather clean of appearance. So just making sure that your clothes are clean and not appearing slovenly.
Right. And think about all the water that's needed for any of these things we've been talking about for cleaning your clothes. If you're having to get up every morning and go to the well and haul that water in, think about the amount of water that would take to fill up a tub, even if you had one. So you're filling up all that water. Are you heating it up first? There's a debate that goes on for centuries whether cold water or warm water is better for bathing. And for much of the 18th century, it's cold water is considered better. But if you're heating that water up, you also have to wait for that water to heat up and then haul it in. And do you also need water for cooking and for laundry that day? So I think access would be important too. And we're talking about a middling farmer and enslaved people living here on the farm. But what if you live in town? You probably don't have a private well. Maybe there's a city well, but can you imagine having to walk to that city well with your yoke and your buckets, fill them up, walk all the way back? Maybe you're waiting in line because other people are there to get their water too, and bringing it back for the day. And if your choice was water for cooking or water for bathing, you might choose the former, just because it would be more needed. So I think sometimes we put our modern sensibilities on people of the past, and even the cleanest person in the 18th century might smell foul to modern people because we are so used to, as Carrie was talking about, shampoo and deodorant and soap and all of those things. So we have always wanted to be clean, but I think what has changed is our version of clean, how clean we are.
I also think it's interesting that at the time it would vary. We're talking specifically about Tidewater, Virginia. But other parts of the world are going to have different, this is the same for today, different parts of the world are going to have different views on what it means to be clean. So what was clean in France compared to what was clean in England is going to be very different. And then if you compare that to what's clean in Virginia, that's even going to be more different.
Right. Yeah, and all the people that are here now by this point in the Revolutionary War time, a lot of the people are country born, meaning they had never been to England or maybe, never been to Angola. And so by this point, they're several generations in. So maybe what was a habit back in England or back on the west coast of Africa has changed over time, or maybe just the access has changed. And so I think you're kind of a product of your environment for a lot of this.
All right, well, you've had a chance to take a look at hygiene in the civilian population. In the military, with the Army, there's some real challenges. You got a lot of people living very close together. The tents house 6 men. Resources are often limited. Simple things we take for granted, like soap and water, are not always going to be readily available. So that's going to add to the challenges of keeping these people clean and healthy. Now, cleanliness in the time period, whether it's civilian or in the Army, is not what it is today, of course. In the Army, you were supposed to bathe whenever you could, which meant maybe once a week, do laundry as well, about that time frame. When water was available, when soap was available, that's one of the real challenges there. Typically, you're washing what's visible. The face and hands are supposed to be washed daily. Now, very often that just meant with water, getting most of the grime off. More importantly, in the time period, you're clean shaven. And so the men had to shave every 2 to 3 days, which meant usually in the evenings before parade, getting somebody to get some soap and a brush and lather you up, and then go ahead and shave you clean so you're ready for parade the next day. You might also have to groom your hair. Now in modern thinking, this is kind of gross, but you would actually grease or pomade your hair. I remember when I was young, the thing with men in the 50s was putting this grease or Vitalis in the hair. Well, that was kind of a thing then, and not only on top of running that stuff through your hair and tying it back, you had to powder it. And very often you didn't have hair powder, so you're going to use flour. So you imagine how uncomfortable and how nasty that might be for the modern person. There's even an account I read of a British soldier trying to prepare himself for parade the day before. That evening he powders his hair. During the night a rat comes into the tent and kind of chews on his hair with that grease and the flour. So definitely not something we today would consider a good hygiene practice, but certainly something that was done in the time period. You would also occasionally do some dental hygiene. It's, again, not like today. Toothbrushes certainly existed. They were expensive. More often an officer might use one of these to brush his teeth. Very often without anything. So if they had tooth powders, they might use those. Many doctors cautioned you not to use those more than maybe once a week because they're so abrasive they'd wear away the enamel. And without fluoride, of course, you're going to be limited what you can do to really protect your teeth against cavities other than just trying to keep the teeth clean. For an enlisted man, he probably doesn't have a brush. He might take a piece of fibrous root like licorice root, chew on that, feather it a little bit and clean his teeth. The licorice root also freshen your breath a little bit if it's available. More often you might just take a cute sliver of wood, like we'd use a toothpick, and just kind of pick between the teeth, or maybe a goose quill. The hygiene being kind of iffy, very often you might end up having to go to the surgeon who, and with a lack of anything else to do, might very often end up having to just remove the bad tooth. So hygiene in the Army was practiced, but certainly not to the level we tend to think would be appropriate today.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope this has cleared up some of your questions that you might have about cleanliness in the 18th century. Feel free to like and subscribe to this YouTube page. Also like us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and have a great afternoon.
We have to hang on to each other. Oh, that'll be funny. How does that look ridiculous?
Oh, hold on.
Do we look like scandalous?
Yeah.
There we go.